Alright, hello everyone. Welcome to today's walkthrough of learning outcomes inside of Canvas by Instructure. My name is Brian Whitmer. I am one of the co-founders of Instructure, and I will be hosting this webinar today. Just real quick, the basic format of the webinar. My plan is to go through the functionality that exists right now inside of Canvas, show you guys how you can set up learning outcomes, how you can align them to resources inside your courses, and then from there I'll talk a little bit about some of our future plans for learning outcomes, how we intend to continue the development and improvement process for this piece of functionality inside of Canvas, and then we'll also take questions. If anyone has any questions during the process, Nate Karchner is also on this webinar, and he'll be keeping an eye on the chat logs, or you can raise your hand, or I don't know, however we do these things with the amazing technology that we have. So, or we can take questions at the end, whatever is easier. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. What you're seeing right here, if you can't see my screen, then probably something's wrong because it looks like it's working. What you see right here is the login page. This is just a demo course or a demo sandbox account that I've signed up for from www.instructure.com. We populate it with some initial information so that anyone that wants to get to know Canvas a little bit can feel free to do so. They can get just a 14-day trial or sandbox where they can play with things, get to know the system, and try to understand a little bit more of the value add that Canvas offers. So we populate some initial information just to help out a little bit with that process, and I'll be showing you some of that content. We'll also be working through some additional resources. So right now I'm signed in as a site administrator. These sandbox accounts let you quickly switch between admin view, teacher view, and student view. It just basically logs you out as an admin, logs you in as a teacher, or logs you in as a student. So only administrators can manage account level settings, which for our purposes is probably the best place to set up learning outcomes. You can create learning outcomes on the course level, which will work just fine. The only drawback there is that there's no collection of data on anything other than the course level. So if a teacher has some very specific outcomes that they have for that course that the university doesn't need to track and that the department doesn't need to track, then the course is a good place for those outcomes to be created. And then they can align them to resources inside of the course. They can have their own reports there and do their thing. If there are outcomes or goals or competencies that the department is looking to track, or the institution as a whole is looking to track, then the better place for them is at the account levels. Now, learning outcomes can be set up at any place in the account hierarchy. So I'm in the root right now. This is just an Instructure sandbox account. But if I went into the sub-accounts and say we have this manually created courses, let's say I had another sub-account that was the English department, I could go into the English department specifically and create learning outcomes at the English department level. And then those wouldn't get folded up into the global outcomes reports and assessment and evaluation. They would stop at the English department level. So that gives you kind of an idea of how you can organize outcomes. The level that you place them at, anyone underneath that will be able to use those outcomes. So if I had two sub-accounts here, if I had an English department and a math department, and there were outcomes created in the English department, those would not be readily usable within the math department. So if you have outcomes that you want to use throughout the entire institution, then the right place to put them is here in the root account. And then anyone inside the entire organization will be able to use them. So on a high level, that's kind of how you would use outcomes. I realize I haven't shown you how you would go about linking them, aligning them, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about that now. So at any place inside of Canvas, whether in an account or inside of a course, you can manage learning outcomes. Here in the account we have this Outcomes tab on the left. If I click that, then what we'll see is a view of all of the learning outcomes that are created at this root account level. We can create multiple groups of outcomes, so we can organize them based on category. And then within each of those groups, we can create a set of learning outcomes that we want to use. So there are 3 outcomes here in the writing proficiency outcome group, and we have additional information about each of those. Some specifics or some particulars about when you're creating outcomes inside of Canvas. There's a couple different ways that learning outcomes can be used or can be evaluated. One of them is just there's a couple different ways that learning outcomes can be gathered up for reports. One of them is using rubrics. So when teachers create rubrics for their course assignments or for things that are going on inside of the course and they evaluate them, they can actually attach outcomes to those rubrics. And then it's a manual process they can pick. For example, you can see here this outcome could be added to a rubric, and it would automatically be given these 4 criteria. And then the teacher would be able to just pick which of those criteria they wanted for the student. And we would say the mastery level, which is what is going to be used to fold this up into all the general reports, would be 2 out of 3. So if the teacher marked it a 3 for a student on this criterion, that would be considered mastery. If they marked a 2, that would be considered mastery as well. If they marked a 1 or a 0, that would be considered non-mastery. So we allow fine-grained detail where they can set any number of points within a range, but then we also boil it down to either a thumbs up or a thumbs down for competency tracking purposes. So like I said, we have these three outcomes here at the account level. If we went to go create a new learning outcome, what we would get, we can create a short description for the outcome, which as you can see up here would be things like sentence fluency or word choice. This would be what would show up on a rubric or on a summary page, so it's important that you keep it relatively short. If there is a longer description, that could be included here, and that could be anything from a single sentence or to a collection of paragraphs that discuss the learning outcome on a more detailed level. And then we have below, as I was talking about, these criterion that can be used if this outcome is ever added to a rubric. Let me go ahead and jump over and show you what that would look like to add a learning outcome to a rubric. So we'll go to the account level rubrics, and we'll just go ahead and start adding a new rubric. Call this our outcome rubric. And we can, when you build rubrics inside of Canvas, you can have any number of rows inside of the rubric. And what's interesting is that you can actually have a different number of columns for each row inside of the rubric. So I can say for this first one, grammar, there's only 2 options, 5 points or 0 points. For spelling, I can say there's these 3 options, 5, 3, or 0. And then we can go ahead and change the points as we need to, and it'll adjust for that. The other thing that we can do, like I was talking about before, when we create our rubrics, we can define all this criterion data. And then when we go and add learning outcome data to these rubrics, it'll go ahead and populate that for us. So if we use the conventions outcome and add that, then we can see right here, it's gone ahead and added all that information for us. We have our short name here. We can click to get the longer description of this learning outcome. And then we have all those point levels that we already defined. And you can see the threshold here on the left. So I see a question in the chat log. Somebody's asking if you need to use whole numbers inside of the rubrics. Currently, yes, that's true. Rubrics only accept whole number values. So now we have our rubric. I'll go ahead and create this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into a course. Let's go to the critical thinking course. And what I'm going to want to do, let's say I want to use this outcome rubric that we just created. I'm going to want to use this for evaluation purposes for a new assignment that I'm about to create. So there's a question here from Stephanie on adjusting point values for specific assignments. Let me actually just take it a couple of steps ahead, and then I'll show you what the answer is to that. So I'm going to create a new assignment. We'll call it our outcome assignment, since that's what we're working on. And then we can edit the assignment details if we want to, and just set it all up. The other thing we can do is we can add a rubric to this assignment. So let's go ahead and find that rubric that we created. It was at the Instructure level. It wasn't inside of the course, and it was called Outcome Rubric 1. You can see that was all the detail that we set up for this rubric. We'll click to use that rubric. Now, you can see, to answer your question, Stephanie, when we add a rubric to a course, there are some things that we can modify and some things that we can't. Currently, we don't allow changing the settings and details for a outcome-aligned criterion inside of a rubric. So there's not right now a way for you to manage that, to change those values. You can change the other values and adjust it to however you needed it, but those outcome level ones are going to have to stay the same. Let's go ahead and add this rubric.
Just explain that.
Sorry, I'm reading a question real quick from Stephanie. Yeah, so I totally understand what you're saying, and that is definitely something that we are going to continue to work on. At Instructure, this is probably an important point to bring up. We are trying, being very careful in our development process, but our goal is to build a next generation learning management system. There's a ton of functionality that goes into learning management, that goes into educational technology in general. And we love what we do. We have a ton of fun with it. Our development process is slightly different, well, it's significantly different than some traditional development companies or some traditional software companies. Instead of what traditional companies do, where it would be, say, once a year, they release a new version of the product, and in between that time, they may decide on a set of new features that they need, and they'll go talk to a couple organizations and get the information that they feel they need, and they'll work a ton internally, they'll do all their work, they get close to the end, beta the product with a couple people that they're comfortable with, and then release it to the world. Instead of having that development process where it takes a long time to actually get anything out the door, and where by the time an end user sees it, it's really too late to do many significant changes. Our goal at Instructure instead is to have more of an incremental development process. So as we build functionality and things, we're releasing bite-sized changes. This actually is a good example of that when we talk about learning outcomes. The first release that we had of learning outcomes was just barely enough to be able to align it to anything. You could add it to these rubrics like this. You could assess using the rubrics and start to build up the data that you were going to need in order to generate reports. Since then, we've continued to work on learning outcomes and a number of additional features using the feedback that we're getting from webinars like this and from demos and from people actually using the product, so that we can make sure that the releases that we do going forward are going to be beneficial for everyone and are going to continue to be useful, instead of gathering a bunch of data and then you not hearing from us for a year. So it's important to realize if there are things that aren't working for you, or if there's an issue somewhere in the process, it's important to us that you share as much information with us as you can. Because that's the whole reason we do it this way, is so that we can get user feedback throughout the process, and so that we can understand if there are concerns or if there are frustrations, or like Stephanie said here, if there is something that just does not work for your particular workflow, then that's important information to get to us, so that we can fold that in as we continue to develop. So this is great feedback. Continue to use the feedback button that you see inside of Canvas. And we take all that information, and we're not just blowing people off when we say give us that information. We're using it. We're actively using it to continue to improve our roadmap and our development plans, and to improve the Canvas product. So Gail Weaver has a question specifically about learning outcomes being used independent of the rubric tool. That's actually what I want to show you guys next. So when we've created these rubric assignments, then, well, actually, before I do that, Gail, I just want to finish this process. So we've created a rubric, attached it to this assignment, and it has outcomes associated with it. Then when we go to grade students on this assignment, what we'll see is that we can use that rubric, and it's just like any other rubric inside of Canvas. We can click to set our values, and we can evaluate students based on the rubric. And then on the back end is where all of that agglomeration and preparation for reports happens. So we can fill in all this information, and it'll all get collected there. And then when we go look at our learning outcomes, we'll be able to see the results of those assessments right here on the Outcome Artifacts page. We can click to see, so what we're seeing right now is this conventions learning outcome that we created. We can see the things that are aligned to it, which right now nothing is other than a rubric. And we can also see the people or the results that have been used for this learning outcome. So we can see that Tom Etch and Bill Blend were both assessed on this outcome. And we can see they both got enough to receive mastery. And then this data is also being collected so that as we continue to work with schools and develop the learning outcomes reporting process, which I don't know that anybody has actually done an amazing job with, but we're collecting the data now so that as we begin to use those reports, we already have the data, and so then we can look back and have the information that we need to give useful results immediately. So that's how rubrics can be attached to learning outcomes. Gail asked about what other options are there. Currently, the only other option that is available is to attach learning outcomes to quizzes or assessments, specifically with question banks. So I can create question banks inside of a course, which are a collection of questions that I may want to reuse or I just may want to organize for my own sanity. And then when we have these question banks, we can actually align learning outcomes to the banks. So we can see right here, this question bank has 3 questions in it. It's actually already been aligned to the evidence learning outcome, which is an outcome that was created at the course level. And let's say we want to also align it to the conventions outcome that we already talked about. We can set a mastery level, which says when they answer quiz questions, if they score a percentage for the question higher than this value, then we consider that a mastery. The interesting thing about aligning outcomes to question banks is that it can give us a lot more data than we would get rather than aligning it just to a specific quiz and the full results of the quiz, and it can allow us to be a little more fine-grained. So we can create question banks that are associated with a specific learning outcome. And then when we create quizzes, we can use that to our advantage. So let's go ahead and create an outcome quiz. And what I'm going to do is, rather than build questions for this quiz or search for existing questions, I'm actually going to create a question group. And I'm going to link that question bank that we were working on, which was the critical thinking question bank, to this quiz. So what I'm going to say is, when people go to take this quiz, what will happen is we will pick 2 questions out of that critical thinking bank, and we will, at random, and those will be part of the quiz for students. So let's go ahead and create this group, and we will publish this quiz. Now I'm going to switch to the student view, and I'm actually going to take the quiz. And what we will see here is 2 of the 3 questions from that question bank have been added to this quiz. They were chosen at random from the bank, so students won't all get the exact same questions, right? And this is a way that you can have a whole collection of questions and only give students a subset at random. So we'll go ahead and answer these questions. Melissa Rizzuto asked if multiple outcomes can be aligned with one question bank. The answer to that is yes. when we were looking at that. Well, let me submit this quiz as a student before I won't be able to show you that. But we saw before when we were looking at the bank, there was a course level outcome that was attached to the bank, and there was also a institution level outcome. So there was the evidence one that was at the course level, and there was also the what did we say it was? Conventions one at the institution level. Okay, so I'm dumb. I don't actually know the answers to these critical thinking questions, so I got them both wrong. Let's switch back to admin view. Now, if we go into learning outcomes, sorry, before I do that, let me just show you, Gail, the answer to your question. So we are here in the critical thinking question bank, and you can see there are 2 outcomes aligned to this quiz, and they can actually have different mastery levels if you want. I'm not sure how useful that actually is, but you could do that, I guess, if you wanted to. So let's jump back over here. It was the evidence learning outcome that we saw. And there are 3 artifacts right now for this evidence learning outcome. So let's jump in and see what that information is. So this first one down here, critical thinking quiz, that was a quiz that I created earlier when I was working on some other things. And then these 2 results right here are the artifacts that just happened as a result of that student taking the quiz. So he didn't get either one of them right. You can see that this learning outcome is aligned to this resource right here. So let's go ahead and click one of these, and we can see this is a report at the course level. We have similar reports at each account level, as you can see over here, where what it does is it shows all of the learning outcomes that have been associated with this course, whether they were created in the course or attached to the course by the teacher. They will show up in this list. This gives the teacher the ability to track the things that they feel are important, while the institution can track those same things if they want to, or completely different things. So everyone has the ability to get the data that they need and see the information that they feel is important and is useful for them. So we can see there are these 3 outcomes that have been attached to the course level. The evidence one, just like we saw a second ago, has been looked at 3 times. The latest score was a 0. We can also click this Show All Artifacts button, which what it will do is it will expand for each of these outcomes. It will show the exact same data that we had before. So we could also click here to go to the account level view, and like I was saying, we're going to see a completely different set of learning outcomes, those that have been attached to the account level, and we can see the results of any assessments. So those same 2 results, the 2 questions that this student answered as part of that quiz that he just took, are right there, and we can see all that data agglomerated. So, like I was saying before, this is what currently exists inside of the Canvas learning management system as far as outcomes go. This gives us the ability to be able to, it gives teachers the ability to evaluate students quickly using rubrics to be able to assess them without having to do a whole lot of setup beforehand. We can even create rubrics at the account level, and administrators can encourage teachers to use specific rubrics if that's what helps in their assessment. Rubrics don't have to be attached to a grade for an assignment. So when I go to create an assignment, I can say, I want to use this rubric for evaluation purposes, but I don't want it to be the determination of the final grade, or excuse me, for the score for this assignment. And that lets them be able to, like the question we had before, that is one option for if you didn't want to use the points that were attached to a specific rubric. Anyway, so rubrics was our initial way of adding these learning outcomes and gathering data. In addition to that, we've now added quiz question banks so that as students take quizzes, we can attach or we can associate specific sets of questions with learning outcomes and use that to continue to gather data. Going on from here, some of the other places that we're looking to improve, first of all, aligning learning outcomes to content rather than assignments and assessments. So that what that will do is it will give us the ability, as we continue, to be able to recommend resources to students, to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of certain resources based on what teachers or administrators think those pieces of content are actually providing information about. In addition to that, we plan to add the ability to use a learning outcome at the quiz of the assignment level. So a teacher could say anybody that gets 15 out of 20 or higher for this assignment automatically say that's a mastery for the specific learning outcome, rather than having to use rubrics for that. That's one additional piece that we are working on. And then also just the flexibility that we need for some of the non-standard use cases that are still important and are still valuable, but that we have not hit yet. So Corey Stokes is asking if there is a way to record what authority a learning outcome came from. So right now, you could technically do that. We give you a rich text editor for the description of a learning outcome, and you can provide whatever information you want inside of that body. So you could easily reference it back to whatever information there was. That actually brings up one of the other pieces that we're looking to add to learning outcomes, which is the ability for an administrator to bulk import learning outcomes. To be able to take, say, the Common Core for 5th grade math and add those resources to an account. Or if there are learning outcomes created somewhere else at an institution, if they can get that into a format that we can ingest, then we can bulk add that instead of having to do them one by one and fill all that information out, which can be pretty tedious, especially if it already exists. So I see a question from Melissa around timeline. I don't have a good specific date for you. These are things that we are currently actively working on, speccing out. Honestly, it would be useful to include some of you in this development process and get some feedback as we continue to go. So if anyone here would be interested in providing feedback on this process and on probably more prioritization than anything, feel free to reach out to me with any thoughts you have or with any opinions you have. My email address is brian@instructure.com, or I'm at Whitmer on Twitter, and I would love to answer any questions that anybody has. Jeff Williams says, can someone at the institution level assign learning outcomes to courses assignments content? Yeah, so administrators have edit privileges on a course, and they can go ahead and associate those account level resources. Let me show you what that would look like. So let's jump back into our critical thinking course. I'm an administrator right now. And we'll come here to the outcomes. What we have right now is the 3 learning outcomes that we created at the course level. What we can also do is we can find the learning outcomes that were created at a higher level. So we have that conventions outcome that we talked about before. And we'll go ahead and add this to the course. And then when we look at those reports that we saw before, we will also see that conventions outcome, which is an account level learning outcome, show up in this report. We can expand to see that additional data. And so, yes, the question I think is, when we do that and we add these things at the course level, are they also going to be included in reports at the account level? And they absolutely will be. They'll continue to be available at the account level and folded up into the additional reports that we're actually currently working on to give, for example, a CSV dump of the learning outcomes and the results of those assessments throughout the entire institution. Because the thing is, as you go forward as an organization, this data is going to get huge, right? I mean, like, it's nice to have a web view to be able to get at what's currently happening or what the latest results are. But honestly, for any useful evaluation of large data, you're not going to you can't do that in a web view, which is why we're going to start providing CSV exports, so that as this data does get large, we'll be able to provide useful information around it. And then you can perform whatever custom assessments or summaries or dashboard views that you want to build. You'll be able to make those yourself, in addition to the ones that we will fold into the Canvas product that we feel will work for most people. So those are the pieces of information that I wanted to get out there on learning outcomes, on what exists right now, sort of at a high level, our trajectory, the things that we're currently working on, Like I said, we would love any feedback that anyone wants to provide. The more information that we can get from our users, the better the product can be. I can't say, oh, if you tell me this is the use case that you have, I can't say, of course we will do that. But what I can say is, that's really important, and I can understand why you would need that use case. So let's see how we can solve the problem without giving you a complete headache every time someone mentions the word outcomes, that will still help everyone else be happy as well. So are there any other questions that you guys have about learning outcomes inside of Canvas? So I see a question on using outcomes that were created in a sub-account. It looks like you're asking about in another sub-account. Currently that's not an option. If you want it to be used by all sub-accounts, then it would need to be created at the root level. We have talked with a couple people, and it seems reasonable to me that one thing that we need to add is the ability to promote resources up a level inside of the hierarchy. That applies to learning outcomes. It also, I think, applies to rubrics and question banks, so that as someone creates something that's useful, and we say, holy cow, that's useful for more than just that course, or for more than just that department, let's go ahead and promote it. Let's move it up in the hierarchy so that other people will be able to use that resource as well. So that's something that we're currently working on. Like I said, it's for more than just learning outcomes. It would also make sense for rubrics and for question banks as well. I mean, it would make sense for some other things, but those are the pieces that we're going to start with first as far as this idea of promotion. I believe there were some other questions. Cool how there's these not arrow buttons on this little chat log. That makes it hard. Corey Stokes asks if there's plans to associate learning outcomes with modules. The answer to that is yes. Farther down the road, one of the things that we're talking about doing is creating more of a packaged resource idea inside of Canvas, so that as somebody builds a collection of resources that are useful and that present a topic or an idea in a positive way, they can package those up and then be able to share them either within the institution or with another organization. As we provide that sort of functionality, it only makes sense that learning outcomes would need to be associated with the package as a whole, in addition to being able to be associated with specific resources. So that is, definitely something that we're looking for. And Corey Stokes is clapping. Isn't there like a clap button or something inside of Adobe Connect? Or are they not that cool? There's totally a clap button. So Quinn is asking when we will have associating learning outcomes with modules. Right now, that's not on the near-term plan. Some of these other things that we've talked about would be added before that. So aligning outcomes to pieces of content, bulk importing. From my perspective, those things need to be there first. They're a higher priority. If the feedback that we get from you guys is, oh my gosh, no, like the most important thing is getting outcomes aligned with modules, then that can change our development plans and how we attack this problem. But that would be feedback that I would need from you guys as a group or as a whole before we would make that kind of a change. There's a question about more reports. We are currently in the process of that CSV dump that I talked about. That's the one that we are working on right now, is getting that out to everybody. We have it released to a small set of our users, and we're just making sure that it's functional and will work for everybody before we release it to everyone. But the big benefit of a CSV dump is that you can use it for what you need it for. As we try to understand the things that people are most going to need as far as outcomes and alignment. The thing is, learning outcomes, there's been a lot of research around it. There's a lot of people that talk about it. I have not seen a lot of good solutions for it. And we're trying very carefully, instead of mimicking something that's already been released, to build a solution that is the right solution and that will work for everyone. And so building specific reports or specific views into the interface, that's something that we are stalling on so that we can continue to build up our expertise around learning outcomes, so that when we do release these dashboard views and these summary views, we can be very confident that they are exactly what people are going to need. And if it's not what they need, then they'll still have this CSV dump sort of resource that we're working on releasing right now, where they can generate their own dashboards and their own views of the information. Yeah, so that's the type of information that Mike G has mentioned in the chat log. That's the kind of thing that they would be able to do once we get this CSV dump out. And then going from there, I mean that feedback's really great, Mike, because that's the kind of information that we need so that we can understand. Okay, this is your use case, and then as we hear about Scott Allen's use case and Melissa Rizzuto's use case, and this other organization over here, their use case, and we can say, oh, okay, the common thread with all of those is this piece of information. So let's get that information out there for everyone, and then we can go from there. And that's something that everyone will find useful. And then if they need to drill in to get a more detail, then that's something else that we can continue to provide and work on. I see Melissa Rizzuto's feedback is actually really good, and that would be the way that I would see attaching learning outcomes to a module. It would be using the mastery process that we already have in place for modules inside of a course. And we would be able to use that and just say, okay, also attach this learning outcome to this module. So as they master that, then we can say, awesome, there it is. As we build up these learning outcome results, the other important piece that we keep track of is where the artifact is and what that actually means, so that we can say, yeah, the student, 3 times out of 5, they mastered this artifact. And then we can actually drill in and say, what does that mean? Oh, it means they took this quiz, which had 3 questions on it. They did awesome on those 3 questions. On the 2 homework assignments associated with this outcome, they didn't do so well. So then we can start to get a detailed view of that information and start to see at a more fine-grained view what exactly is going on. And that can be helpful from a reporting aspect, but also from an evidence aspect, as organizations need to prove the quality of their programs. They can use those specific artifacts, which are already linked inside of the system, to say, look, this specific student on this specific outcome created this artifact, and they did well on it, and we thought it was great, and you can see it right here. So having all of that data in a way that we can share, we can build reports around, we can drill in using the interface, is important because it's what makes learning outcomes actually usable. The flip side of that, when we talk about encouraging instructors to leverage learning outcomes, that's the tricky part, because we can't make it so difficult for an instructor to use learning outcomes that they're never going to. It needs to be something that's streamlined, and it needs to be something that's part of their standard or their normal process. And so as we build these functionalities in, we're trying to be very careful to make sure that we're doing it in a way that we're not going to add an additional load to instructors, but that we're still going to provide a way to show that these outcome results are meaningful and are useful. So Mike, it looks like, has some feedback on a CSV export, and I do appreciate that sometimes CSV dumps, for example, can be difficult in some cases to build information around. As a general rule, what data dumps provide is something that everyone can use. And if you guys need help in finding a way to quickly transform that information into something that is useful for you guys, then there's a lot of resources for that. And we can point you to some. We can provide you guys with some help in how to do that efficiently and effectively. One of the things that we're trying very hard to get to with Canvas is to make Canvas into a platform rather than just a product. So when we talk about custom reports or custom pieces of functionality, we're very careful what we fold into the product. Like I was saying before, we want to make sure that it's something that's useful for everyone. And if it's not, then what we would prefer to do instead is find another solution that we can tie into in a seamless way or in an efficient way to get at those special cases and special requirements that certain organizations have. And so if you'll pay attention over the next couple months, you'll see a lot of things in the release logs for Canvas that will point to more of this platform approach, and will help make it a little more clear what we're trying to get at, and how by providing resources programmatically even to other systems, that we can provide a flexible environment. So we don't have to say everyone is going to have access to this report that it turns out 5% of our users need, and we can instead say those 5%, let's find this other solution. Let's integrate it seamlessly so that it's part of your user experience. It's not complicated and it's not like patched onto the side, but it actually is part of the experience, and let's leverage that resource over there in order to make this happen. So like I said, that's something that you guys would definitely want to keep an eye out for in our release logs and in the notes that we put out, is this transition that's going to happen for Canvas to become more of a platform and to enable more of these kind of programmatic accesses to the data. So thank you guys. We appreciate your time. We appreciate all the input that we've gotten on this. Like I said before, if you guys have additional questions or feedback that you want to share, feel free to shoot them to me, Brian at Instructure.com, or to Nate at Instructure.com. You can stick them on our Facebook page. You can send them to the mailing lists. There's a lot of ways you guys can get in touch with us. And like I said before, while you're using the system, if there are things that don't make sense to you or that you feel like could be improved upon, please click that feedback button and give us the feedback that we need. We'll engage you and try to continually improve the product and make sure that what we're doing is what works for everyone. So thank you guys for your time. We appreciate this, and I'm going to check